call it my soil health journey. Back when we started farming, we didn't know any better. I mean, back the five principles of soil health are keep the ground least amount of disturbance, keep the ground covered, as much diversity as possible, a living root as long as possible, and then integrate livestock. And I guess back then, we were started out with full tillage. It was plow, packer, pony drill. If any of you guys can remember that, and then we probably had a third that was summer fallowed, and that was usually cultivated and then seeded, field cultivated and seeded with a drill. Back then we thought that practice you were saving moisture, but really what you were doing was increasing the carbon into the air, but with all the tillage, and we were actually degrading the soil, losing our organic matter. So that was, I guess back then, I guess we just didn't know any better. And also our rangeland was pretty much, we probably had 3 or 4 pastures total that back then, with probably 3 herds, you know, so it was, and now we do very high stock densities. And so that's just a little history of when I started farming through now. This is our family. We raised 5 children, and now we have 11 grandchildren. It's kind of neat. They all live in Mandan, so help is never far away. We, my oldest daughter and her husband, and my youngest son and his wife have took over most of the cattle operation. They do it on shares or lease some of the land. So it's like I said, I'm 71 years old, so I got to kind of slow up a little bit, I guess. So anyway, this is our crew, and I'll go through some of the conservation practices we've done throughout my career. I guess without I had a lot of help and assistance with from the Morton County Soil District and also the NRCS and other agencies as far as helping with cost share or learning about these practices. So over the years, we put in a lot of shelter belts, waterways, diversions, terraces, grass strip, tall wheatgrass strips, and summer fallow. That was, again, we were fighting the wind and water erosion, which was terrible on these. The land that we farm is such a variable in the soil. It can, in a field, it can vary from below sand to a fine sandy loam to a heavy clay pan, gumbo, to bentonite from off the cut banks. And so it's some very low producing land. And back in the tillage day, you'd probably have in a 10-year period, you'd probably get a couple of years of decent, good crops, and maybe 3 or 4 that were just break even, and usually had 2 or 3 failures within that 10-year period. So it wasn't, the risks was quite high back in the tillage day. And then on the pasture land, we put dams and dugouts. That was the big thing back in the 70s. The technology wasn't there for pipelines till, I suppose, in the 80s when we started putting in pipelines. And so we probably put in, well, I'm sure over 2 miles of pipeline. We probably got a dozen water tanks or water points. And then the biggest thing that helped was cross fencing our pastures. Right now we've probably got close to 100 pastures. We've got the native pasture down to about 20-acre paddocks, and we do irrigate. Like I said, we irrigate about 250 acres in one pivot. We've got that set up with an intensive grazing system, and I'll go through that. And then on biological weed control, I put down, we had probably about 300 acres of spurge out in the native pastures in the rough terrain, so it was tough to control. And back then, we just used helicopters and planes. We sprayed, but we didn't realize what we were doing. We were killing the forbs, killed a lot of trees. Then we started adding the biological. We started getting the flea beetles, and that seemed to work out quite well. It took about 3 or 4 years, and pretty soon the spurge numbers started going down, and then the flea beetles really took off. You know, that was a very good practice. And I'll go through some more of that a little later. And then on the cropland, we quit tilling probably in the late 90s. I guess we went from full tillage to minimum till and then no till. But just because you quit tilling, you're not going to be successful either unless you add the diversity. You got to add more crops in your rotation. But then when we started doing the cover crops, the mixtures, that's when things really happened very quickly. And so we did cover crops, and then our plan was to seed our cropland back to grass. But first we had to heal the land. So then we did want at least one year of covers, cover crop mix, a full season, and graze it. So you get litter on the surface and you start changing the soil biology. And on some of the toughest land, we did like 5 years in a row of warm season cover, and we grazed it. And at different times of the year, and I'll go through some of that too. Then now we did some pollinator plantings, and we did winter water. Again, we keep the livestock away from the yard. And we did wildlife food plots, again, to help out the wildlife in the winter. And we got a solar water system, and I'll go through that, where we pump water out of dams and dugouts and into water tanks. This was a picture of there's two farms side by side when I was growing up. One was my grandfather's farm, and this was my dad's farm. And I guess what I want to show you there is how rugged the rangeland is, deep ravines and a lot of real hilly. And like I said, we're right off the Missouri River. The cut banks are there's a ridge about 200 to 300 feet high. You get tremendous erosion off of that bentonite. And so this was a farmstead, and that's what it looks like today. My wife Bonnie took this picture on top of the cut bank and looking down. The only building that's left, I guess, is the house, and that's been totally remodeled and added on with the garage and everything. So anyway, we added, as you can see, we added a few trees. And here's a couple of my granddaughters out picking flowers and pollinator plantings for Grandma. And then in the winter, we get tremendous amount of wildlife, whether it's pheasants, turkeys, deer, whether it's whitetail or mule deer. I took this picture when we just got home from work. We had cleared snow around the grain bins, and that evening there was, I'd say, roughly between 80 and 100 mule deer in the yard. And so I always say, if you want the deer to hang around your yard, plant your cover crops close to the yard. If you want them over at the neighbor, plant them as close to the neighbor as possible. So you can manage wildlife with the covers. And again, we create habitat for the native birds, the songbirds, the small ones, and then the large ones. There's a golden eagle. This was taken by Lucy Love from the Audubon. We had a birding tour a couple of years ago. And that was very interesting. I never realized there was that many different bird species just around a yard. I think that in this day and a half, they counted, I think, 40 some species of birds. So it was kind of interesting, a very good day. Then, of course, we do have these critters, the rattlesnakes, but that kind of keeps the government people out of your land. And we also do grass finishing. Again, we had, I said it was probably 2004, I believe it was. I started working for the Morton County Soil District. I worked there for about a year and a half. And then I moved over to Burleigh County, and I worked there for about a little over 10 years, 10 and a half, and I retired there in 2016, I guess it was. So back then, our goal was just custom graze. So I sold our main herd back then. They were Simmental Angus, and they weighed that 1,500 pounds, very large animals. And then we started purchasing some smaller framed animals, some of the older bloodlines. They get a smaller framed animal. They're probably between 11 and 1,200 pounds. They probably should be a little smaller yet. But these here will finish on grass. So when we We don't use any vaccines anymore. We don't do any pour-ons, no implants, and very little antibiotics. And if we do have to use antibiotics, if we get a sick animal, which is quite rare now, we will we won't sell those as grass finish. They'll sell in the regular market. So that again, when we both were working off the ranch, we quit calving in February and March. Now we calve in late May and June. I went to that Ellen Savory School back in the mid '80s, and back then they said, "Why are you calving in the ugliest time of the year?" And again, my response was, "Well, everybody else does it that way, and we want to get the calving done before we get out in the field." Well, it seems now that we switched, it's probably the best move ever made was switching to that late May and June calving, so they can calve out in the pasture. And like I say, when we both were working full time, I probably wouldn't even check the cattle. Sometimes every third day, and sometimes once a week. They actually did better without me being around. And also, we do a no-till garden. We kind of cheat there. We don't like to hoe, so we don't want to disturb the soil anyway. You shouldn't hoe. You should pull weeds if you have to. Anyway, we use tree fabric, cut slits. It takes a lot more time planting, but it keeps the ground covered. Of course, we normally lay down some old rotten straw or manure first, and then that's how we built these soils up too. But they're just showing a little later in the year. Of course, we're right under the pivot, so we've always got water. And there's grandkids. They were supposed to be out pulling some weeds, but I guess they were enjoying the day. And here's in the fall, our grandkids picking pumpkins, digging potatoes. Potatoes are very interesting. You cut a slit in the fabric, take a small spade, push the soil over, put your seed potato in, push it back. And when it's come time to dig potatoes, they actually are right under the fabric. They'll push the fabric up. So you just reach in that slot, and there the potatoes are laying. So it makes gardening kind of fun. I'll show a picture of the native rangeland where we got it seeded back to grass. Our grazing system. So I also forgot to mention, we also custom graze for the neighbor. He brings anywhere from 90 to 120 head each year. And we normally graze on the lower two cells there. And then we have the pivot. We run a herd there, and then out on the right to the west of it. And then we also run a herd down the river bottoms. We would like to run all these together, but it's the highway there. It's just so much traffic. It's tough to move the cattle back and forth. So that's why we run a herd down the river bottoms. That can be a challenge too. On 2011, it was that man-made flood. It flooded there from May through August. So that year, there wasn't much grazing down there. So we just had to move them home, but to run everything on the pivot and these other paddocks at the time. And then on the native, we got that broke down to excuse me, about 20-acre paddocks, and they were moving every 1 to 3 days roughly. And most of the pastures get grazed probably just once throughout the season. If it's a wetter year, the ones that get grazed in June, they will be fully recovered, and we can either stockpile that or we can again just cover your improving the rangeland. So, but generally on a drier year, then they're usually just in each pasture one time, so it gets plenty of high density and then long rest periods. And this is how we set up the pivot. We've got there's 5 water points, so then there's 18 paddocks total. And when we first set this up, we just did half of it, and we did like the wagon wheel, and with 1 water point in the center. And that didn't work out the best. You had such long, narrow paddocks. And another thing, if you wanted to hay some, you can't hay across those tracks that were ruts. So here, by going with the arc, you can 8 of those paddocks. Plus you can, it's easy to split these up. They're 7-acre paddocks, and then we'll split those up into thirds yet, so we get very high densities. And they're just showing again, the 18 paddocks was roughly 7 acres. Just showing the center. We used just a poly white tape there with a gate handle. And then, like I say, when we cross fence it, it's hard to see the poly wire there, but used to step in posts, make that very simple. Put up a rig on the four-wheeler, can unreel your wire. You don't have to get off the four-wheeler. You can step the post in as you go. That probably takes 10 to 15 minutes. I can set up 2 fences, so it's actually kind of fun to do that. And then our pipelines, we've got a shallow pipeline and on the pivot there for the water, and we use these fiberglass tanks. I think they're 2,000-gallon tanks. So always got fresh water. Again, just showing the center. You can't see the tank there. And the cattle out on the pivot, again, very high density. The only problem that we have with the pivot is if you're not running the pivot, the cattle get bored. They'll rub on the tires and pretty soon they're pulling wires out of the control boxes. So then they can make a mess there. So you got to generally have the pivot off the paddock that they're in. Or if the water's running on a hot day, it actually works out quite well. It keeps them cool too. So here's just kind of showing a before and after. On the left was grazed, and on the right was not grazed. So again, when we graze it, we probably take maybe a third, just top it, and a third to a half, and you move, and then it will recover very quickly. Here's showing out on the native. There's 60 plus paddocks out there. Again, I said there were about 20-acre paddocks, and you get the high stock density. This paddock here, when it was season long, it would look like this carpet every year, just about. Now you're getting tremendous production. Like I say, this is how our pastures used to look in the middle of the summer. Again, quite a bit of bare ground. And then late in the fall, there's not much litter left. Then another one is no use. This was a pasture that joined ours. It was season-long grazing, just like ours was for maybe 40, 50 years. Now it's been laying idle for maybe 25 years. So you can imagine it's just a thick thatch layer of Kentucky blue. That's probably 90-some% Kentucky blue, a little bit of spurge in there, and a little bit of sagebrush. But again, to me, no use is probably worse than overuse or continuous grazing. Again, you can see the thatch layer. Excuse me. It's actually, the Kentucky blue is actually thinning out, starting to die out. It's getting that thick under there. So no use to me is a bad thing. And again, your healthy range has a tremendous amount of diversity, whether it's, there's probably over 100 species, they say, out in your native prairie. You've got cool season grasses, warm season grasses, forbs, weeds. There's a tremendous diversity out there. That's how our range developed. Again, it's showing the big blue stem before. I never really knew what it was because you never saw it. It was there. It was just grazed right to the ground. So, and again, tremendous vigor. We can get through a drought without destocking. Generally, we got like 2006 was an extremely dry year too, and we got through that with no problem. 2018 again was another quite dry year. We had no issues. And this was a view from the center. We were again, the wagon wheel is very narrow and it fans out. And what I've noticed there, just by observing the grass species shifted the quickest where they got the most impact. So that told me the smaller the paddock, the higher the density in long rest strip periods. You can really change that in a short time. And again, forage remaining. This was same paddock that I showed before with the tall grass in there, and it's the big blue stem. Again, this was taken in August. We grazed that in August, but still it was high nutrition. The cow fat are still dented, so the nutritional level is still very high. We've also done nutritional balancer to nut ball in late December when we were grazing native, and it still showed the nutrition was around that 8 to 9% protein yet, and so it met the needs of a lactating cow. Again, we don't calve in June or late May and June. We don't wean our calves till about mid to late March, and so the calves are on the cows all winter. Again, you get tremendous production. Right now, we're probably running 3 times the grazing, or the grazing days, probably getting about 3 times the grazing days per acre of what we did when it was season long. So you can, and that's all done by I call it the Voodoo Fence. When we first started putting in the high tensile wire, people were so used to the old electric fences that shorted out, that caused fires, and these new energizers, you can't start a fire with them, and they got tremendous power to them. You can train animals very quickly. We like to use about at least a 10 to 12 joule energizer, and that'll do miles and miles of fence. So here's just showing some of the fence designs we did. First, we started out with 2 wires, the top one hot and the bottom one ground, and about 6 to 8 inches apart. We used you need a strainer to tighten it, and we used to use the spring that gave it a little more give, but that's really not necessary. Now we just generally just go with 1 wire hot. So when you got a ground and a hot, and let's say a deer runs through it or under it, it'll got a splice, it'll catch and short out your whole system. So we've been changing some of these 2 wires back to either 1 or making them both hot. Like some of our border fences are just 2 wire hot, or if it's 3 wire along a county road, then we'll go with the top one hot, the middle one ground, and then the bottom one hot also. So that's, and again, you can see we made them quite low. The cattle could jump right over if they wanted to, but they really respect that electric fence. Once they get a shock, if they're trained, even the custom cows, it took probably 2 or 3 moves, and they had that figured out in a hurry. These are some of the overhead gates that we've done. There's the gates when it's closed, and that's when it's open. So now you've got a gate that's, if our posts are 80, 90 feet apart or whatever, you'll have a gate that's well over 100 feet wide, and so move cattle under through it, and the cattle will follow it, generally moving with a 4-wheeler, and they'll just follow you right under. They get so used to being moved, because they get moved all the time, so then when they see you, they just come. And on the pivot, where it's single wire, we'll just take a piece of PVC pipe, cut a slit in it, let's say about 8 feet long, and just propped it under the wire. And if I drive through it with the 4-wheeler, they'll follow you right under it. If you lay it on the ground, they will not cross it even if you shut it off. They really respect the electric fence. Here's just showing our single wire electric. This was late in the fall, so you can see how much residue we left. Again, it's very economical to build. It's a psychological barrier, so you don't need a lot of posts. I mean, the specs are up to 100 feet apart on level terrain. And this here just showing the Kiwi braces. We've been using those. They've been working out quite well. And we put shutoffs. Here's also, this was down by the way southwest unit where the water point is the Rice Creek running through it. So that's fenced off the creek, and then we got 2 wires there. And I'm going to change those. The top one is hot and the bottom is ground. Make them both hot. And then on the end of the fence for our gates, I still like to do a physical gate there. We just use a gate handle, a single wire. When it's off over the winter, they will, a lot of times something runs through it and tears your gate handle off. So I figured it's just easier to put out something physical there, and that's been working out quite well. And here you can see the offset when we get power down to that other unit. You could have used a solar unit down there with solar panels, but for some reason people like to shoot them, so it's easier to run the 110 power down there. And actually, even this shut off on top of this post, someone had to shoot that off. So there's always maintenance you got to always be watching for. Again, just showing the offset. We'll go about I never like to put it on a barbed wire fence because then you just got issues of shorting out. Just go a couple feet away from it. It doesn't take much to build that. We're also quite rugged off these cut banks. So you got deep ravines. Sometimes you got to cross them. This one, it's probably hard to see, but the fence runs across the top, and we just dangle the wire down in the ravine. And cattle, if they come in the ravine, they'll see that, and it works out quite well. In the wintertime, you get snow there, and it's not going to tear your fence down. Here you're showing another one that isn't quite as deep. Just run a fence across the top, and then there's the temporary fence on the bottom. So if you get a hard rain, it'll tear that bottom one out, but it's at least not going to tear the whole fence down. Another thing I want to show there is this grass growing in the bottom of that ravine. That used to always be just bare ground, just like this one here. That's about how this creek used to look. What I wanted to show here was how the fences start filling in. Again, this was right up by the cut bank. You can see the bottom wires already silting shut, so we always got to keep maintaining that. And then the first picture was taken back by the cut bank, so this is about 300 feet out, and this ravine was probably 6-8 feet deep. Yeah, and now you can see it's filling in. You can see the grass starting to grow in the creek. And then this picture was just taken another 300 feet out where the other cross fence is. You can see an insulator in the bottom of the post. So when we put this in, it was probably about 3 foot by 4 foot wide. The ravine there, that's already filled in. And this here one shows those two ravines came together. So about half a mile from the cut bank, and that's a railroad tie. You can see there it's pretty much covered up, and that was put in by hand, so it probably was out of the ground by a good 6 feet or more. So that's how much that's filled in. And there's western wheat growing there. There's some foxtail barley and some sagebrush. So you can see you can heal the land. I mean, otherwise this soil would have headed down to Missouri, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and created problems down there. So we got to hold our land back. But you can also create problems with fencing. The water point is over the top of this hill. You can't see it from here, but anyway, the two fences come together there. So we created a gully there from the trailing. So we remedying that by added another water point, maybe a quarter mile to the north of this, and then you can just either run a hot tape around that and throw or in the wintertime when we're bale grazing, just unroll some bales in there, and eventually you can easily fill that up. Here it's showing where just trails used to be this open, and now they're filling in with grass. And again, there's another photo of where cattle trails used to be, and they're all grassed over already. And then on our water lines, we generally we use this PE pipe on the shallow line that's on the pivot. For example, that's probably only 2 feet down. And we'll in the late fall, we'll open a valve in the well pit and open your valves by the tanks. So some of the water will drain out, but the rest, they'll freeze. And it seems you can freeze these lines and they'll thaw out in the spring. It doesn't seem to hurt them any. It's been quite foolproof. It came apart where it teed off. The line were teed off. That's the only problem we had with this one. And then out on the native prairie there, there's that service these tanks. It's 6-7 foot deep. There we put in large fiberglass tanks. They're, I believe, 4,500 gallons. Again, we're pumping the water. This pipeline here is over 7,000 feet long, and it lifts about 20, 30 feet, so you don't get a lot of pressure at the other end. But with a large tank, you got plenty of volume there. Plus the changes, the cattle's behavior when you got them in a small pasture, their whole herd doesn't come to drink at once. They'll be staggering out back and forth all day long. So these have been working out. They've been working out quite well. And some of the tanks, instead of having a hydrant there and a float system on top, we drill a hole in the bottom of the tank and put your valve and float off the bottom. That way it can get, you can utilize the water here a lot longer. It'll freeze the other end of the tank will be froze, but by where your valve is, that'll stay open a lot longer, so you can get more use out of these tanks late in the year. In the cell centers, we've got 2 of these centers where there's roughly 18 to 20 paddocks coming off of it. So it would make it small, so then that way the cattle won't, they'll come in and drink and go back out. They won't lay around in the center. If you make that very large, cattle on warm days, they'll just lay around the tank. Well, hear this, they'll drink and you're back out in the pasture, putting your tongue and urine out where you need it. And we still use our dams and dugouts as backup water, but as you can see there, the grass is growing right up to shore. We can imagine if you had a cattle in there any length of time, that would just be all mucked up. But that still wasn't good enough. We put these solar panels on it. They're on a trailer with a battery backup, and you got a floating pump. And you pump the water out of the dam. You fence the dams off, pump the water out of the dam into the permanent water tanks. We've got 3 sites like this. The only issue we have, once you start improving the land, pretty soon your dams and dugouts don't fill up in the spring because you're not getting a runoff. They're over the summer. So a couple of these dams have been very marginal late in the year. So that's one disadvantage of improving the land. And then, like I said, I told you about biological control. Here you can see the steel post. When I first put the flea beetles in there, that probably was knee-high to almost waist-high solid spurge through them draws. And that took about 3 to 4 years till they got established. And they just wiped that spurge out. And the draws or the shaded areas, the flea beetles that work the best are the flava. And then out in the open where it's thinner and more upland stuff, they're the nigroscrutus. But then after 4 or 5 years, they were all mixed together. So shown another one. These draws used to be solid yellow in late June all the way up to the cut banks. And now I'd say we probably took out anywhere from 50 to 70% of the spurge. But then over time, I guess we started this probably in the late 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. And then we got into the wetter cycles, and pretty soon the spurge numbers starting to build. We would see less insects, and now the insect numbers are building again. So it's Mother Nature's way of controlling or managing the invasive weeds. And then, like I said, we'll stockpile grass, so we'll winter graze. We can get by with some years. We can get by grazing till well into January. This year we made it, I think, to January 5th, and then started bale grazing. But anyway, we'll stockpile the grass. We say we have 6-8 paddocks or more that we want to stockpile that were grazed, say in early June. And those we'll just stockpile, and or some we won't graze at all and use them for winter grazing. And again, we'll shift them around from year to year. they're showing, that was 2012, we still were grazing. Again, calves are on the cows. And when we graze in the wintertime, we still rotate them. So, for example, if we've got 6 paddocks or 8 paddocks that we're going to graze, and we estimate there's 4 days in there, 5 days, or whatever. We'll probably graze 3 days in there and keep rotating. Then just come back to them the second time. Then we'd roll out a high-quality alfalfa bale in each pasture. And so then you don't have to supplement them a lot less. That way you can keep the cattle out on the range a lot longer, and plus the rumen with the high quality hay, it keeps the rumen function working a lot better. So this was about the 15th of January that year. You can see we've got a shelter there, and we're starting to bale graze in. And this is, again, we had a portable shelter set up, plus these thermal sinks. They seem to be working out quite well. It's actually 3 cylinders. It's 3 compartments together, but it's 3 cylinders. Center one has a cover, and your float and valve is under that, super insulated. Then the water comes up from the bottom, feeds the other 2 cylinders. And those will work out once it gets down to 10 to 15 below. If nothing is drinking, then they will freeze up. So you got an inch or 2 of ice in the morning. You got to knock that out. But what I'll do too, that if it's very cold or it's storming, I'll just haul some hay there. Then the cattle stay there, and they'll keep it open. It's not 100%. We had issue this year about 10 days ago when the first cold spell hit. Here, my son went down to check the water, and here the water was running out the side hill. So that wasn't a very good day. So we were going to try and dig it up, but that would have been quite a battle. The ground would have been really froze, and trying to work out there when it's this cold wasn't fun. So we just trailed them home. It's about 2 miles. Trailed them home, and bale grazing at home now. So then we can go back down when the ground thaws out. We'll go back down, and we can utilize what bales are down there then. This picture shows when we first started bale grazing. I did this right by the yard, right north of the yard. It's about a 10-acre field, so we set out roughly enough for 100 days. Back then we didn't have, that's when we were starting to build up our herd. So we just run a hot tape across each row. So we'd set up, like, say, 2 rows, and then so you had a back fence. And they're showing it. That was the year we had a lot of snow. So then we would still have to take the tractor up there once a week and push the snow, and then drill a hole with an electric drill, a portable drill or battery powered. We'd drill a hole and stick these. We use those. They're just like a rebar rod. They're about 3/8 with a insulator on it. Set that up, but that was a lot of work too. So now we say when we first bale grazed, we were right north of the yard, and now we're bale grazing to the south. There's 6 paddocks in the south. That was way to the south unit. What was that was cropland that seeded back to grass in the late 60s, I think it was. So that's where we bale graze. So there's 6 paddocks there that we set up bales, and sometimes we'll set up like 11 weeks worth of 11, 12 weeks. So we just split each one of those paddocks with a hot tape. So you got 2 weeks supply on each pasture. So then once a week you just go down and open a gate. So you can make the wintering cattle very, very easy. And again, this was 2015. There wasn't much snow then. There you can see the graze eating on the bales. Then again, January 2017, that was that ugly winter, and we had 3 blizzards in December or in late November, whenever it was. Anyway, the bales pretty much were covered up, so that was quite a challenge. And then it got worse in February. You can see there how much snow was there. So that year I actually had to buy a bobcat with a snow blower, and we blow from one pile of hay to the other bales, and then make a loop around it and zigzag through it. But the cattle made it. And again, I really didn't have much choice. I had hauled out, like I said, about 12 weeks supply of hay out in the pasture. Now it's all snowed under. Well, I'm going to have to we had to use it. But it worked out. And this is just showing the field north of the yard where we first bale grazed. You can see in June the custom cows came, so we run them through there. But you can see where the bale rings were, the amount of litter. People say, well, that's a lot of waste. But no, that's carbon you're putting back into the ground. By the second year, it's pretty much all grassed over. And on this photo, I was going to show, like I say, the photo on the left was when I took a picture of the side hill. You can see where the bale rings were, the different height in the grass. So I drove up there with the four-wheeler. You can't even see the four-wheeler. The brome grass is that tall. And before you bale grazed, the grass probably grew 8 to 10 inches high. And a lot of years didn't even head out, so it was really lacking a lot of nutrients. So we clipped some of that where you bale grazed. It showed there was like 8,500 pounds of material, and the non-bale was about 2,500. The protein was about 4 points higher, and the TDN was just a little bit less where you bale grazed. So you can over triple your production, add more nutrition to the plants, to their diet. So you can, again, with bale grazing, you can save fuel costs. You don't have to start a tractor in the winter near as often. You get a higher quality feed in the summer. So it's just kind of a win-win situation. And this was a study we did with the Central Grassland Research Center. They did 4 sites, one at Puddle, Wing, and in Napoleon, and then at Fort Rice, or at our place. And some of them did show there was less production where you had bale grazed over the control. But on mine, we set up bales probably a little farther apart. Someplace they put them too close together probably. Anyway, we set them a little farther apart, probably 40, 50 feet. Now we probably go about 30. But anyway, the first year that we bale grazed, in 2016 on that field, we did this test. It was about 1.6 times production. And when they did this study, they would, where they set the bale, we put a metal peg so you could find it the next year. And then it clipped there 5 feet, 10 feet, 15, 4 different sites around that bale. And then they'd combine that. So that's where they come up with the amount of production there. And they clipped it all right to the ground. And then I fenced those sites off so we didn't graze them in the summer, so I could tell what our production was. Anyway, the first year it was 1.6 times where we bale grazed. The next year it was 3.9 times production. In 2018 it was almost 4 times the production there. And in 2019 it was about 800 pounds more. And 2019 was a very wet year. For some reason, the linear control did a lot better too. So, and then again, trying to do the 5 soil health principles. Again, back when we started, had no diversity. It pretty much was spring wheat, oats, and barley, and corn for silage, and probably a little bit of alfalfa and grass. So anyway, we had the cool season grasses, wheat, oats, barley, and in the cool season broadleaves, we added field peas and flax in our rotation. And then in the warm season we started planting corn for grain. Now that you don't till anymore and you got cover, we utilize a lot more moisture and you could raise grain corn where in the past you couldn't. And then warm season broadleaves, we did add soybeans into our rotation. And another warm season broadleaf, sunflowers. We never ever grew sunflowers, but always put them in our cover crop mixes. They do very well. This picture I want to show, this was after a barley crop. We started doing our cover crop mixes. This was, what I want to show here is we combine the barley and spread the straw. And if you look straight down, I don't want to see the soil when I plant. I want that much cover. That That's what it looked like. Again, it was seeded August 2nd. It was probably in the 90s. It was very hot and very dry. We got just a little bit of moisture, say 10, 12 days later, stuff was coming up already. But again, if you got the ground totally covered, I imagine if this was bare ground, how hot that would have been. Nothing would have came up. So this would look like September 23rd. It was almost knee high or better. You can see the turnips and radish that are really taking off. Your millets, Sudan are doing quite well too. So we started grazing that at the end of September, and before it froze, and then it would graze well into October. But it was so high in nutrition, we actually set out a trailer with a hay rack with straw, and they consumed quite a bit of straw just to balance their diet. And then again, we grazed it in late December. And in some years, we will plant a cool season mix strictly for haying. And but then when we hay it, this is a mix of that's forage barley. There's hairy vetch. There's turnips, radish in there, Italian ryegrass, probably buckwheat in there. And when we do hay it, we set the shoes as high as we can on the hay machine, so you leave quite a bit of stubble hay. And if it's, again, we hay it quite early, it's usually probably around the first part of July. This would look like mid-August. The vetch was coming back, and the barley was actually heading out again. The turnips, they're just taking off again. Then that year we grazed that in December, and right after I took this photo, we had dumped on with that was another one of the years we had all that snow, so it covered everything up. So that we moved the cows out and started bale grazing. But then the deer moved in. There's probably 80 to 100 deer. That's dig through that deep snow, and then the pheasants would follow them. And so again, you created perfect diet for the wildlife. Then again, we grazed that probably in late April, first part of May in the spring, after the frost was out. Then when I saw what was happening on the better ground with the covers, I figured, well, why not try this on some of the poorer land. This was a field right south of the yard. It was 24 acres. That was right off the cut banks. So this field varies from pure sand to heavy clay or gumbo to a bentonite that had washed off the hills. So in the past, even in the grazing system, this wouldn't, it never really produced very much. We'd probably get 2-3 days of grazing in the spring and maybe a day or two late in the fall. We move the cows back to wean or whatever. So that year, it was 2000. I can't remember the year now. But anyway, we mixed. We grazed it in late May. Probably grazed a little harder than we normally would, and then let it regrow a little bit. And then we sprayed it with Roundup. And about mid-June, we planted this mix. It was cowpea, soybeans, pearl millet, Sudan grass. We had some corn up, so we threw a little of that in. Usually the corn doesn't do very well in a mix, but we threw that in. And sunflowers and turnips and radish and sweet clover. In other years, actually this field we did 5 years in a row. So other years we added Italian ryegrass and probably buckwheat. We tried sun hemp, just experimenting. That's what it looked. Yeah, it was 2009. That's what it looked like in September. My granddaughter was standing there, so it was about 3 to 4 feet high. I was pretty pleased with that. The next year it actually was better, and then the third year we had just planted it, and it was just coming up, probably a couple inches high, and we had a tremendous storm, real wind and hail and a heavy rain, and it just sheared everything off. But all that really came back was the Sudan grass and the pearl millet and a few of the sunflowers. And then a tremendous crop of pigeon grass because you had that heavy downpour. So I didn't want that to go to seed. So that summer we started raising that in, it's probably late July and well into August. So we strip grazed that. We had, I think, about 60 pair in there. And then we had posts are about 80, 90 feet apart. So we'd just run a hot wire across. I would just drive through that tall stuff with the four-wheeler, but you'd just leave a little bit of a opening. The cows would see that in your wire there. They respected that. Then again, we grazed it in probably in December again. I believe that year we got, I think it was over 60 grazing days per acre that time. And then we, most years we would graze it like in late November, December, January. Now this same field, like I said, we did that 4 years or 5 years in a row, and then planted it back to a diverse mixture of grasses and legumes and forbs. And so in 2015, we grazed it. We grazed it twice that year, and that's what it looked like. At the end of the year, we had tremendous production there. So by doing the covers, you heal the land very quickly, get the soil biology more in balance, break up those tillage layers. So when you seed it back to grass, you'll be a lot more successful. You'll get a very deep-rooted plant right off the bat. And again, the resilience there is tremendous. Here I want to show, this was on the pivot on the east side of the road. This was July 9th, we planted that. It was after a winter wheat crop, so we hayed the winter wheat, and I rented the district's drill, and we planted cowpea, soybeans, crimson clover, berseem clover, sweet clover, hairy vetch, Sudan grass, pearl millet, prosa millet, buckwheat, turnip, radish, kale, sunflower, Italian ryegrass, oats, and field pea. Again, that was seeded on July 9th. And that's what it looked like in early October. That year we didn't get a frost. You can see the peas were blossoming yet. That was like 7-8 feet tall. So then we started, used a pivot as a fence. So we went on this pivot as a half circle, so went on the outside track and measured the distance and then split that into 20 paddocks. And what we would do is hay machine on the outside, you could see the center pivot point, cut your way in, then I would drive to the next point where we had flagged, and on the four-wheeler I'd hold up a flag on top because you couldn't see it, stuff was so tall, and just cut your way out. So anyway, that's how we set it up. And here you can see in late October, we started grazing. I think we had 105 pair out there. You can see the Sudan and the pearl millet that froze, and your cowpea and soybeans, they were gone. But the radish and turnips and the kale and the Italian ryegrass, everything's green under there. So you've got a very high nutrition, got the drier stuff in there plus the greens. So it really balances their diet. So the cattle did very well on that. Again, just showing where we cut the strips. You can see that we put a high tensile wire on the pivot. This one showed a little better by the tires. I put in these plastic posts. They're kind of like a composite. You don't need an insulator on there. You just staple that on. And then halfway between, we hung a PE pipe and with an insulator, screw an insulator on the bottom of that. And what would come through the tall crop, it would just, this would lift up, and when it comes to open, it drops back down. Then at the end of the pivot, it'd still have to go with a temporary fence when we moved it. Again, just showing after we grazed how much litter we left. And all the dung and urine out there, so you add a lot of nutrients. Again, we overemphasize the fact that we want the ground totally covered, so it's ready for 2018 planting. And that year, I think we planted oats and barley, or oats and vetch, and we hayed that And then, again, bins, these were alfalfa fields for our hay production. We want to try and build that back up. As again, when you hay it, you're taking everything off. This way so we rotate out about every 5 years the alfalfa, and then plant these covers at least 2 years in there, and then double cropping it, so you can build them soils up. So that's here's economics. Again, on that field, we got 26 days of grazing with 105 pair. And I just estimated a 2.5 pound day gain on the calves, so that would be 122 pounds of beef. And if they were worth $1.70, that was $200, $207 an acre. And the expense of the cover crop seed was probably about $40 an acre. The drill rental was $10. Fuel probably was $3 an acre. Chemical, we did spray it before we planted. It was about $10 for spraying. The electricity for both crops was about $26 an acre, and irrigation repairs for the season were about $10. So we had about $100 expense. That still is $100 income just grazing the cover crop. Again, we hayed the winter wheat first, and that was probably about 3 bales an acre. So it's very, very profitable. This year we did the pivot that had rye on it. We hayed that. We hayed quite a bit earlier this year. It was, I think, the 20th of June. So we got the cover crop in earlier, and had pretty much the same mix. And I think we've got just about 80, I think it was 87 grazing days per acre on that. So we've got 37 days of grazing on that other pivot, about 60 acres. Again, I always say soil health is priceless. And then I think we were the 2017 Aldo Leopold Award winners, and I think they were going to show that. They did a 5-minute video with a drone, so I guess they'll probably show that. With that, I want to thank you, and again, I'll be around that day if you want to ask questions. So again, thank you. We operate about 2,000 acres, and of that, over 1,400 is into grass or native prairie, and there's a few acres of cropland that we can't graze, and plus then we irrigate about 250 acres. My main job out here is moving cattle and watch the grass grow. I mean, it's just monitoring the before and after when you bring the cattle in a pasture and how much you graze. This land is quite fragile here. The soils vary so much off these cut banks. A lot of this land should never have been farmed, but back in the tillage era, the erosion, whether it was wind or water, was just tremendous. And I could see when I first started farming, we've got to change.
When we first started, the conservation part was more protecting the land from soil and water erosion. We planted lots of trees, the grass buffers, we did some terracing. That's what we did because that's what was there at the time. Now it's developed into more protecting the soil itself.
I started rotational grazing in the mid-late 80s. We pretty much started on the rangeland first. But the biggest thing that changed the rangeland was when we broke that out into very small paddocks and short time in each pasture, large numbers, but then move, let it rest, recover. That changed our rangeland tremendously. On the native and some of those that were seeded back to grass, we've got 60 plus paddocks. On the irrigation system, we've got 18 permanent paddocks, and those can be split again with temporary fencing. We're down to roughly 20-acre paddocks now. Then we quit tilling the cropland and added way more diversity in our rotation. And then we added cover crop mixes, and now we're seeding just about all our land back to grass. We want to try and imitate the native range as much as possible. So we're planting anywhere from 8 to 11 different species, native, warm season, cool season, plus introduced grasses and legumes and forbs. We always hear this word now, sustainability. Well, I don't want to sustain a degraded resource. We want to regenerate it. And when you start adding diversity into this landscape, the resilience just takes over it. Before it was kind of feast or famine. With the diversity, we're changing the soil biology. If you take care of the life in the soil, it'll take care of the stuff above the soil. And all we got to do is give it a home and keep it covered.
The change came when we realized that the soil is alive, that there's organisms underground that need as much care as the organisms above the ground do. It takes a while to realize that, I think. And once you do, it changes your heart. It changes the way you look at things. It changes the way you make decisions.
You got to get livestock back in the land. You get the diversity of animals and the diversity of the plants, which creates diversity underground. And you got to be able to be profitable to do it. So you just figure out how to manage the land, I guess. And once you figure that out, I mean, it makes it fun ranching. We're a third generation farmer. We took over my dad's farm, and my grandfather's farm was right next. We took over the ranch in 1973. There was 2 small farms side by side, and we've added a few quarters onto that since. I want to leave this land in better shape than when I got it.
I think the closeness you have to nature out here is probably the most valuable part of being here, of raising a family on the farm, is just having that closeness with nature. Just taking them down to the garden and having them help gather pumpkins or dig potatoes, or that stuff is stuff that people can do in town, but there's just something nice about being out here.
It's quite an honor to be recognized as a Leopold's Award winner.
It humbles me beyond words. I don't even know what to say. It makes you realize that what you're doing is important. I think the important part of having the responsibility of taking care of the land is your award in the end.
You start building healthy soils, it makes for healthy plants, which makes for healthy animals, which in turn makes for healthy people.
Okay, so we've got Kenny Miller on the phone, I believe, unless it just dropped off.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, there we are. Hey, Ken.
Okay, we finally got it figured out.
Yes, perfect. So if you
First
guys...
off, I'd like to apologize for the audio on my presentation. I had a cold that day, so I could tell it wasn't coming through the way I wanted to, but that's the way it is.
That's no problem.
Yeah.
So how we'll do this is, if anybody has any questions, they can shout it off in the chat box, and then I can read it aloud, and then Kenny can answer it for us while he's on the phone.
Okay.
Or Kenny, do you have video up?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so you'll be able to see. If you go down in the lower bar, there's a chat button. You can click on that, and then you can be able to see anybody that writes anything in the chat box.
Oh, okay, okay.
So if anybody's got any questions, feel free to ask. I guess while people are thinking about their questions, I do have one for you, Kenny. How did you figure out how the potatoes were going to work in your no-till garden under the fabric? Was it just an experiment, or?
Well, we actually, when I worked for the Burley County Soil District, we did a no-till garden, and we did a little different there. We laid, put some compost down, and then we laid straw or alfalfa hay on top, and then let the stuff grow through. So I thought down here I'll just try it with fabric, and that worked out quite well. Again, the potatoes were just, it pushed up the fabric, and the potatoes right under fabric. You didn't have to do much digging; you just pull them out.
That's really amazing. I've sold a few people in my area on fabricating their gardens the last few years, and the people that do it are just really, really loving it. So it's awesome to see.
Yeah, it's a lot, takes a lot longer to plant it, but then you don't have to do any weeding basically. And then plus it holds the moisture under there, and the ground I think it stays warmer in the evenings. And I think because we planted them quite late, that was in June that time, and we had all kinds of potatoes by fall. So
that is awesome. Okay, so Josh has got a question. Besides sunflowers, has there been anything in your mix that did not grow well?
Like so usually corn didn't do very well in the mix, or we did sun hemp, and that didn't like it at all in there either. So, but other than that, the more diversity you put in the mix, it seems like if something doesn't do very well, others will take over or whatever. But and another one was sugar beets. We tried sugar beets. I thought that would be great, but they didn't like it at all. They didn't amount to nothing in there. So
why do you think the corn is having such a problem? Is it just because of the moisture levels in your area?
Well, I think it's the competition, because you get a quick canopy, and you'd have a little bit of corn in there, but it wouldn't do very well.
Okay.
Maybe Ryan's... other areas without more moisture, maybe it would work out better. But again, here we're usually fairly dry in this area. But even under irrigation, we planted covers in there too, and the corn didn't. If you put any corn in the mix, it never seemed to amount to much either.
Interesting. Okay. Ryan's got a question. How many years have you gotten out of the fabric on your no-till garden before having to replace it?
Oh, let's see. That's been, I think we got 4 years out of that already. Yeah.
4 years. Wow.
Again, if you cut, like say we do the potatoes, we'd cut slits there. So then the next year you'd probably plant your tomatoes or your cucumbers in those same spots, so we're always rotating our crop in there too, but it seems to last quite a while, the fabric.
So are you leaving your fabric down continually, or do you pull it up in the fall and then add compost or anything?
Like say when we first put it down, I put down quite a bit of manure and a layer of straw, and that's all decomposed under there. So that's all we've done. We haven't pulled it up in the fall. We just leave it.
Cool. Shannon would like to know, what kind of spurge bugs did you put in your field?
Those were they call them flea beetles. There was a flava, and then a nigroscrutus was the other scientific name for them. But they were through the weed boards, and is where we got those. But again, they don't work in real sandy ground, because the roots, the fine root hairs on the spurge have to be close to the surface, where in the sand, they'll go very deep. And then when they lay their eggs there, the small larvae will not make it to those root hairs. They have to feed on those root hairs, and they don't survive. So in sandy soils, it doesn't. You won't get them established. I mean, they'll do fine in there, but they won't overwinter. You won't see nothing the next year.
Wow, didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's where at first they wouldn't. They'd only release them on Corps land or federal land or state land and stuff. They wouldn't. They were experimenting too, and they put them down the river bottoms here, and the the insects didn't survive there, but they moved out up in the side hills, out of the river bottoms. You know, that we started noticing them there. So they were learning too. You know what, where to put them. You know.
Wow. Okay. Jeff would like to know, is it better to mow or graze cover crops to build soil?
Oh, definitely grazing them. Yeah. You know, anytime if you mow it, well, if you mowed it and left it, I suppose it'd be all right too. But you're not getting the impact from the animals, the trampling, and then the dung and urine. I mean, that's all part of the soil biology. You know, so it's better to graze them. But I mean, if you don't have livestock, I guess that's still instead of haying it, just cut it and leave it. You know, that's definitely the second option. But I definitely, if you can get livestock, that's the way to go.
Is that true for like all livestock? Are we thinking even goats and sheep and chickens?
Yeah, definitely chickens, whatever you want to put out there. But again, it's how you manage them. You don't leave them on there and take it all off. I've had guys tell me too, well, we planted cover crops and now the fields are blowing. Well, we grazed them. We took everything off. Well, you got to still manage that. You got to, again, when we do the covers, we want, like I showed some of the picture, we want the ground totally covered so maybe you take half to 3/4 of it, even that. And, but again, get that residue trampled. And that's when you're getting a cover. I mean, again, for the soil biology.
Very good. Okay, Ryan would like to know, what do you think is the most critical element of restoring degraded or saline soils?
For saline soils, I'm not really that familiar, but I think they're again, get some salt tolerant plants, but get around that saline area, start using up a lot of that moisture, because basically the saline area is caused by the moisture coming up and bringing the salt. So if you can utilize a lot more moisture, but definitely don't till it, even if there's just kochia growing there, just leave it, or you could graze it too, you know, but again, you get some salt tolerant plants and get some grasses, and then farther out, get some deep rooted plants, maybe get some alfalfa. So you're utilizing that moisture. And then eventually, I mean, it took a while to build those saline areas. So it's going to take time to restore it too.
Yeah, so just a live root on the soil is really important there.
But that's
right?
Very important. Again, when a lot of these fields, what do they do when they spread fertilizer? They still spread fertilizer over those areas, or they spray. So you're getting way too much nutrients there too, because there's nothing growing, basically. So that's probably a detriment too. So.
Very good. All right, Shannon would like to know, is all of your land irrigated?
No, we irrigate about 250 acres. And the one pivot is 128 acre one. It's a half circle. That's the one we got the grazing system on. And then the other two we'll put up for hay. But again, we won't plant straight alfalfa anymore. We'll plant a mixture of alfalfa and grass. But then when we take the alfalfa out, like so normally every 4 to 5 years, then I would like to plant, then I do the cover crop mixes. And like say, for example, you put winter rye or winter wheat, and then hay that, and then plant the cover, and then graze that, like I showed on them videos there. It was that's, again, I want at least probably 2 years of covers, and then I'll seed it back to grass and alfalfa. But that's kind of our hay supply. Those other two pivots are they're around between 50 and 60 acre pivots. So they're the smaller ones.
Okay, awesome. All right, when moving fences, can you mostly reuse the same wire?
I'll use that poly wire on the reel. Yeah, those last quite a while. I mean, I would say you probably get 5-6 seasons out of it. It depends on how often you're moving them, or if you're dragging the wire. Where if you walk with the reel, then you're not dragging the wire, then it lasts longer too. But the others are all permanent high tensile wire. out in the native pastures, and then your border fences are all pretty much all high tensile wire.
All right. JD Hansen would like to say thank you, Kenny, for promoting these practices West River. Always appreciate you taking the time to entertain our producers on your operation. It has helped many of them in making decisions and achieving their goals. So sounds like you're pretty influential down there.
Well, we've been, I guess it was a lot of it started from working at Burleigh County. And then we were asked to speak at a lot of different functions, and like I said, we have tours down here. They're sure welcome to come and see what we're doing. So.
Yeah, that's fantastic. All right, does anybody else have any other questions for Kenny while we have him on the phone? Okay, well, thank you again for joining today, Kenny. I know it was a process to get you lined up here on the phone today. Thanks for bearing with us, and we really, really appreciate everything you're doing for conservation in North Dakota. It's really awesome.
Okay, well, you guys have a good meeting.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. Yep. Bye now.
Bye. Okay, for everybody else, we will join back up at 1 o'clock or 1:15. Try to be on at 1 so that we can get everybody broken out into their breakout sessions. How this is going to happen is you're going to get a prompt when we get it set up, and then you can choose which breakout session you would like to go to. So even though you've registered for one, you have the option to take in the other one if you would like. So join us back here at 1 o'clock and we'll get started again. Thank you.